Mendel wanted to examine what would happen if plants carrying one pair of contrasting characters are subjected to cross pollination. So he conducted cross pollination experiments. Initially, he concentrated on one pair of contrasting characters. Plants with one pair of contrasting characters. If you recollect, while discussing about plant reproduction, we have seen that in hybridization experiments involving cross pollination, one of the important aspects is emasculation. The stamens present in a flower are to be removed before stamens, pollen grains from another plant is transferred. So Mendel used this technique, what we call today as emasculation, and conducted cross pollination experiments using one pair of contrasting characters. So he selected initially a pure breeding tall plant. How was he sure that this was a pure breeding tall plant? He had obtained this tall plant from self-pollination by another tall plant. Similarly, a pure breeding dwarf plant. What he did was, he removed the stamens from the dwarf plant, retained only the gynoecium, collected the pollen grains from the tall plant, and transferred the pollen grains from the tall plant to the stigma of the flowers in the dwarf plant. He patiently waited for the formation of seeds. A large number of seeds were formed. He collected all those seeds and sowed those seeds in a separate place. To his surprise, he found that all these seeds developed into tall plants. For a moment, Mendel was wonderstruck. Of the two contrasting characters, tallness and dwarfness, only one character had expressed tallness. So he started thinking, what may be the reason? He thought like this. Initially, he had transferred the pollen grains from the tall plant to the stigma of the dwarf plant. Therefore, he had used the tall plant as the male plant, dwarf plant as the female plant. Therefore, he thought tallness found in the male may be dominant over dwarfness found in the female, and therefore only tall plants resulted. He wanted to confirm this. So in another set of experiments, Again, he took a pure breeding tall plant and a pure breeding dwarf plant. This time he removed the stamen from the tall plant, retained the gynoecium, so used that plant as a female plant, transferred the pollen grains from the dwarf plant to the tall plant. Just reverse the situation. Again, cross pollination was successful, seeds were formed, he collected the seeds, sowed the seeds. Once again, to his surprise, all the resulting plants were tall. Mendel was not satisfied. He repeated these experiments with all the other characteristics which he had identified in the pea plants. For example, he selected a pure breeding plant with axial flowers and conducted a cross pollination with a pure breeding plant, pea plant, with terminal flowers. Even in this situation, of the two contrasting characters, only one character expressed in the next generation. All the resulting plants had flowers in the axial position. Same results were obtained with reference to all the other pairs of contrasting characters he had obtained. Based on the results of these experiments, Mendel came to a conclusion that of the two contrasting characters, found in a plant, one character only one character expresses itself in the next generation. So this next generation, the first generation of offspring, so we will call it as F1 generation, F1 standing for first filial generation. Similarly, this is F1 generation. So of the two contrasting characters, only one character expresses itself in the next generation, F1 generation. The character that expresses he described it as dominant character. The character that expresses itself is the dominant character, and the character which fails to express he described it as recessive character. So this was the first conclusion that Mendel was able to arrive at in the course of his experiments. Of the two contrasting characters in a plant, only one character expresses itself in the next generation. It is the dominant character. and the character which fails to express, it is the recessive character. So in the cross between tall and dwarf plant, tallness expresses itself, so it is the dominant character. Dwarfness fails to express, therefore this is the recessive character. Similarly, between plants with axial flowers and plants with terminal flowers, only plants with axial flowers are formed in the next generation, so the character for axial flowers is dominant over the character for terminal flowers. This idea came to be known as the law of dominance. Law of dominance. It is now generally described as Mendel's first law of inheritance. Mendel's first law of inheritance. So in all the 7 pairs of contrasting characters that Mendel had identified in the pea plants, one character was dominant and the other character was recessive. The character that was dominant could express in the next generation whenever there is cross pollination, and the character that fails to express is described as the recessive character. Now Mendel wanted to know the tall plants that resulted in this cross involving a tall plant and a dwarf plant. All the resulting plants were tall. Now Mendel wanted to know, so he wanted to know what would happen if these tall plants of the F1 generation were allowed to undergo natural self-pollination. He waited, collected the seeds, sowed the seeds in a separate place, and found that in the next generation, we will call it as F2 generation, second filial generation, there were both tall plants and dwarf plants in the ratio 3:1. Roughly 75% of the resulting plants were tall and about 25% of the resulting plants were dwarf. The result was surprising because earlier what he saw was only tall character expressed and the dwarf character did not express. But now the dwarf character reappeared. He repeated this experiment with other characters. Same results were obtained, similar results were obtained. So again Mendel started thinking, if dwarf character reappeared in this generation, probably the factor or the particle responsible for dwarf character must have been present in these tall plants in a form in which it could not express. That was the conclusion that Mendel was able to come to. To find out this, he started representing these crosses in a different way. We will come back and see that.